Hi, I'm Mike McLean. Welcome to the Short Circuit podcast brought to you by Swift Aircraft. In this series, we'll be chatting with a variety of people from all walks of life, but who all have one thing in common: aviation. We'll discuss how and why they got into aviation, what or who inspired them, and what they would say to encourage young people to get involved. Flight fascinates many of us, and our guests will explain why they are compelled to look to the sky. Today's chat is with Peter Merlin. Peter is an amazing character whose experience of aviation and aerospace is remarkable. Over the years, his access to the restricted areas and people in the shadows has been extraordinary. In this conversation, he gives us a peek behind the veil of intrigue that covered aerospace at a time when it was front and centre of the minds of the developed world. But before we start, I have a request. Please remember to click the like button, share with friends and colleagues, and subscribe. This really does help us get the word out. So, with that in mind, here goes. Good afternoon in the UK, good morning in the United States, and welcome to the Short Circuit, Mr. Peter Merlin. So if you'd like to tell us who you are and what your current role is in aviation.
Well, I was born and raised in Hollywood, California. I spent most of my life in Southern California, as a matter of fact. My parents were actors, and somehow I became interested in aviation.
Right, okay. What was the spark for that? What got you looking upwards?
I I don't know if this is actually the what got me going. I became interested in aviation from a very young age, and one of my very earliest memories, in fact, my absolute earliest memory from the standpoint of being able to peg it to a specific time and place, involved my first exposure to airplanes.
Right.
My father had gone down to Brazil for about a week to do a episode of a Tarzan TV series
Okay.
with Ron Ely, and when he flew home, my mother took me to Los Angeles International Airport so we could meet his flight at the arrival gate. And it was a Varig Airlines DC-8.
Mm-hmm.
After everyone had disembarked, my father picked me up and took me into the cockpit and sat me down. And I, to this day, remember looking at that cockpit panel with its various glowing lights and all the switches and stuff that I had no idea what it was. And the fact that this memory is so vivid is all the more significant because I was only 2 years old at the time.
Wow.
And I still remember that. I gradually gained an affinity for aviation and space exploration. Of course, growing up in the 1960s and 70s, you had the Apollo program. I remember watching the Apollo 11 moonwalk live broadcast on TV. So, all of that really captured my imagination and sent me down the direction that I've followed. And I've worked in aviation now basically all my life.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing, isn't it? Going back to that, I mean, we are of a similar vintage, and global events back then. I sat and watched in school. We wheeled out the TV so the whole class could see, watching the Apollo 11 moonwalks, and we watched quite a few takeoffs and stuff. And it was such a big thing. It was yeah, in the developed world, it was a massive thing that was going on.
It was interesting for me to watch some of the early space missions on television. I remember taking a day off from summer school to stay home to watch the Apollo-Soyuz link up in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the American astronauts on that mission was Vance Brand, and I didn't know it at the time, but eventually I was going to be working with him at NASA. And in high school, the space shuttle was coming along. I got to see the first landing of the space shuttle Columbia out at Edwards Air Force Base. Then I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University,
Hmm.
where I got my Bachelor of Science degree in aviation management. And I thought I would get into the aerospace industry eventually. During my college years, I spent a lot of time at Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center, got to see a lot of rocket launches. I was there for the Challenger disaster. And after graduation, I moved back to Southern California. But it was a time of downturn for the aerospace industry. So I ended up working for SkyWest Airlines, which
Hmm.
I did for about 9.5 years. And I didn't really see any future for myself in that industry, but an opportunity came around. NASA Dryden Flight Research Center, which is located out at Edwards Air Force Base, had a position open for a historical archivist because they now had a history office. They were trying to put all their heritage together. And I applied for that job, having a great deal of knowledge by that time of aviation and aerospace and the various NASA flight research programs. And I ended up working there for close to 20 years,
Wow.
doing history, education, and public affairs. And then after that, I spent several years under a contract to the Air Force, also at Edwards, supporting flight test and evaluation programs, mostly in terms of helping project engineers put their test plans together and then the final reports when they got their tests done. And COVID came along and things got kind of weird. The world was a strange place.
That's
Uh,
one way of putting it.
yeah, it really was. And so my wife and I decided to quit our jobs at Edwards, sell the house in California, and move to the Midwest.
Right.
And I ended up getting a job with the School of Aviation at Southern Illinois University,
Hmm.
where I am now teaching several undergraduate courses in aviation management while simultaneously earning my master's degree.
Okay. So going back a little bit, so when you first started in the industry, what was your role? What were you actually doing? I mean, were you on the engineering side or admin side or flying or what was
Well,
going on with you?
when I joined SkyWest Airlines, I was what they call a station agent, which is
Mhm.
sort of a jack of all trades. I mean, you've probably heard of a ticket agent or a gate agent or a ramper who works outside
Yeah.
loading and unloading things. And I did all of that and more. I sometimes worked the ticket counter. I sometimes worked the gate. Sometimes I was out on the ramp. I worked operations, talking to the flight crews on the radio. And occasionally I worked the dreaded lost luggage counter.
Oh, good grief.
Yes, I could tell you horror stories about that. But the main thing is I learned a lot about the aviation industry on the airline side, looking at all these different aspects of it. There really are quite a lot of different careers with the airlines besides just uh, pilots and flight attendants and like that. This is just a vast number of different things. And it was, again, not really using my talents to the greatest degree. So I was happy to move over to NASA, where I first uh, helped put the historical records in order for the Flight Research Center. And then eventually, my position ended up being funded by the Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate at NASA headquarters. And so I was kind of doing two jobs. I was working at Dryden, supporting history, education, and public affairs. And for the ARMD side, I was writing books and monographs and research papers, all peer-reviewed documents for NASA and AIAA and a lot of, basically some of them were program histories, technology studies,
Hmm.
lessons learned in aviation and aerospace safety, a lot of different subjects. My most recent NASA book was a history of the Environmentally Responsible Aviation Project, which was a 6-year effort in which NASA teamed up with industry to develop and mature technologies to make aviation more sustainable and less harmful to the environment. So we're talking about making aircraft that are quieter, more fuel efficient, less harmful emissions, better ways of building airplanes, and more sustainable processes, alternative fuels, all these different kind of things.
All right. So on that subject, because that's boils down to an awful lot of what we've been talking about on this series. Pick two. What are the two technologies or changes that you see coming over the horizon that you think will actually make a significant difference that in a generation's time they'll be commonplace?
Well, I think one of the areas they're working really hard on are more efficient jet engines. And they're not just quieter, but more reliable and more fuel efficient. I think we're going to see some really good engine technology come along. There are also alternative types of aircraft propulsion. Electric propulsion is big.
Mhm.
And the other area, of course, is alternative fuel sources. So, we're looking at everything from biofuels to hybrid fuels to hydrogen as an alternative fuel. And there's been a great deal of research, much of it quite successful. So I think we're going to see that expand quite a bit in the future. I don't think we will be able to rely on some of these biofuels and some of the other alternative fuels as much as people would like, just because it's hard to devote that much arable land for growing crops that could be turned into biofuel. It's just not entirely feasible to do that to the extent that they would like.
Mhm.
But I think that will still be a major issue.
Yeah, it's one of the things that keeps coming up in conversation when you as soon as you mention hydrogen. I watched something. No, I listened to something the other day on the radio, and the subject was hydrogen. And as they introduced it, I said to my wife, "You watch the first couple of minutes. All they're going to talk about is the Hindenburg," and that's exactly what happened. And then they went on for the next 8 minutes talking about how safe hydrogen was and how it would be useful and it's pollution free, etc., etc., etc. But by that time, they had terrified the audience by playing the audio from the famous bit of audio and all the horror and all that sort of business. And you just think, why does everybody have to focus on one particular accident that was a long time ago and basically nothing to do with hydrogen itself? It was,
Right, precisely so. I mean, yes, hydrogen in gaseous form is flammable. It's going to be in liquid form for aircraft fuel, and the Zeppelins and the airships had this doped fabric, aluminized doped fabric covering the entire airframe, which was highly flammable just in itself. So
mhm.
once you ignite that, of course, that's going to burn, which the Hindenburg did, but that's not an issue for modern aviation. It's
No,
just not.
yeah, it's completely irrelevant, but we're still hanging on to that. That was, I can't remember how many years ago exactly, but I mean, it's getting up there now as an issue.
Sure. And that was yeah, I think 1937. Anyway, the point is, I understand why the programs that report on this use that as their lead in. And the reason I understand that is because, as I said, I was born and raised in Hollywood. That's just it's it's a bad habit of the producers of these kinds of shows that they feel a need to over dramatize things that really don't have anything to do with the actual subject, but they bring in the viewers.
Yep, it's very true. It's very true. So I'm just looking at the clock. There's one section that I really don't want to ignore, and that is the whole STEM youth outreach type um, of subject. So you mentioned something earlier on about just communicating with young people and that sort of thing. So can you tell me a little bit about what your involvement has been in that area and any advice that you would give to young people coming into or even considering aviation, and in this case, I'll say aerospace.
Sure. Well, I've had a lot of involvement with that with NASA. I worked with the education program. We had a great deal of outreach outreach for the STEM programs, trying to interest young people anywhere from, elementary school on up to college age to get into science and engineering and mathematics and aviation and flight. And so that was a lot of fun working with all these different kinds of people. And now I do that in Southern Illinois University's School of Aviation.
Hmm.
So I am literally teaching a new generation to enter the aviation job market. We have a lot of people who are primarily focusing on a flight career. They would like to be pilots, and we do have flight programs, but we also have a lot of people who want to become aviation management types, and there's a lot of different opportunities. In fact, one of my courses covers a great many different kinds of aviation jobs, not just pilots and flight crews, but air traffic control, airport management, which goes off in a whole bunch of different branches just by itself. There are government jobs and agencies like the FAA, the NTSB, a lot of aviation industry jobs, designing and building new airplanes. It's almost limitless, really.
Yeah. When I started doing this series, in my head it was like there's more to it, it was very simple. It was just to try and explain there's more to aviation than pilots and engineers. And the more I've talked to people, it's become blindingly obvious that everything applies in aviation. There's an aviation version of just about every job that's out there. And to me, it's crucial to get this out into the world and to make young people aware, because I'm not too sure what it's like in the States, but in the UK, aviation is not as it's not as popular as it was when I was a kid, and I don't see much activity of youth trying to get into aviation. I think a lot of that's because they just don't think about it. It's not visible to them. I mean, I'm assuming you're getting good take up for your courses at the university. So what sort of feedback do you get from your students? So that do they become enthused? Are they excited by the thing?
I think they are, and particularly if they're motivated to pursue their education in this regard, and many of them really seem to be, and they almost have to be because they're spending so much money on the program just to pay the enrollment, and particularly the ones at the flight courses, which are very expensive. But really, I've had students who say they're going into aviation law or financial management or any of the other, like you say, pretty much any kind of job you can think of. You can just slap the word aviation in front of it, and it does apply.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad I'm learning, and hopefully our listeners are learning as well. And if they're starting to share these with the youth of today, then that's a really good thing for me. Right. So I will address your book. So I was told about your book, Dreamland, available on all good online bookstores, as everybody knows. And I bought this massive tome, and I've been flicking through it. I haven't sat down and read it cover to cover yet, but I'm just dipping in and out because it's huge and totally and utterly fascinating about the subject. So if you want to tell us a little bit more about, here's your chance to plug your book.
Sure, this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and some 40 years ago, I was reading a book about the U-2 spy plane, and it mentioned that it had been flown at this secret airfield in Nevada
Mhm.
called Dreamland or Area 51. And so I'd never heard of that. It sounded very fascinating, but there was very little information available. And of course, this was before the internet was really a thing. And so I decided I'm going to learn more about this. And I spent the next several decades doing exactly that, uh, which involved eventually meeting a lot of the people who had worked there, collecting thousands of pages of government documents, hundreds of photos. And eventually I thought I should put this all together in a book. And so that became Dreamland, The Secret History of Area 51, which is, more than 550 pages, more than 700 photos and illustrations. It's pretty much the definitive work on the subject matter. And I, of course, was introduced to Area 51 in terms of airplanes. I never had any of that baggage that surrounds it in terms of UFOs and flying saucers and all that weird stuff. It was all about airplanes, and that, remained true as I met the people who had been there, on various different projects and got to know them and what they'd done. And so my book is the first scholarly history of the National Classified Test Facility.
So and the thing that caught my eye when it was recommended to me, and when I got the book, I bought the book, and then as I started reading it, what pleased me so much is that it isn't all about the nonsense. It isn't all about the fantasy. It isn't all about the what would be the common impression of Area 51. It's about the aircraft. It's about the technology that was developed. It's about how it works or worked. And it is, I mean, it's a fascinating read, I must admit. It'll keep me going for a long time. I'm looking forward to the winter when I'm not doing anything else, because I can then sit down and really get dug right into it. But it is a big book, but the photography, which is one of my big passions, the photography in there is fantastic. Especially the cover, the front cover picture. When I finally got it, it took me, I was a little bit slow, but when I finally got the picture, I chuckled for a couple of days. It was great, absolutely brilliant picture.
The cover was my first opportunity to play with and subvert many of the UFO tropes. And in this case, it was a picture I took of an airplane that had been tested in the early 1980s for developing stealth technology. And it just, if you glance at it quickly, the first impression is, oh, a flying saucer. But the more you look at it, then you start seeing the wings and the landing gear and the tails, and it's like, oh, it's an airplane. And I got to meet some of the people who flew it. The chief test pilot, Dick Thomas, was a good friend of mine. It was just a fascinating story of aeronautical engineering and technology development that was really pioneering in its field at the time. So, yes, I was happy to include a big section of the book on that. And fundamentally, the story of Area 51 is really the story of the people who made all those airplanes, who designed them, who built them, who flew them, operated and maintained them. And it's just really an amazing story, and I was happy to put it down on paper.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that. It's certainly going to keep me entertained for quite a while. Um, Again, going back to something you touched on earlier. You said you grew up in Hollywood with your parents in the movie business. Was there any direct link with aviation there? Did your parents play in any? Because back in the 60s, 70s, there are a lot of films about aviation. Was there any crossover there, or was that just?
No, there really wasn't in that case.
Oh, well, that's a shame. That would have been a nice tie-up.
It would have been, yes, it absolutely would have been. My father was mostly in a lot of westerns and war, World War II type stuff and science fiction, Mission Impossible, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, stuff like that. He played a lot of villains.
All right. Oh, so and what was his name? You mentioned it earlier, but I missed it.
Right, Jan Merlin, and his first starring role was in a television series called Tom Corbett's Space Cadet, which was an early space opera from the 1950s.
Right.
And
Okay.
so when you hear the term space cadet, that's kind of where that comes from.
I've met a few in my time. But okay. Oh, that's good. So you are based at the university. You're teaching the next generation. So that brings us round to really the big question. So I don't know if you had a chance to look at the website, but on the swiftaircraft.com/podcast, if you go to there, you'll see our virtual control tower wall with our picture boards on it, where all the guests get to pick their airplane, and we stick it up on the board. So we come to the biggest question of all, which is our signature question. And that is, what is your favorite airplane and why? And in your case, I'll broaden it open to your favorite flying thing, because I suspect you might have other stuff other than just airplanes.
Well, certainly. And a question like this is always difficult for me
Hmm.
because there's so many different aircraft that I love for different reasons. It would be easy to pick the low-hanging fruit and say, well, the SR-71 Blackbird, because it's such a technological marvel of engineering and design for its time and all that. But I'm going to go a different direction and look at one of the airplanes that really was one of my early favorites. When I was very young, I came across a picture in a book of the Northrop YB-49A flying wing. And
Right.
that began my overall love of the flying wing design in general, because they are just such elegant aircraft. You've got an airfoil and no conventional fuselage or empennage whatsoever. It's just a wing. So it's a
Hmm.
boomerang shaped kind of plane. And back in the 1940s, Jack Northrop was experimenting with a variety of different types of flying wings of various sizes, looking at the idea of future military aircraft, future commercial aircraft. None of them ultimately went into production, but many years later, after he had retired, Northrop Corporation won the contract for the B-2 stealth bomber, and that turned out to be a flying wing. And
Hmm.
because as it happens, a wing is a very easy kind of design to make virtually invisible to radar. And so, in fact, the B-2 had a wingspan exactly the same as the YB-49. And we're talking, some 4 decades later. So
Yeah.
really, I just love the flying wings, and the YB-49 was the one that kind of gave me that love of flying wings.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. But yeah, the flying wings, because there was the 49A, and there are a couple of other ones that they did. So they had some that were jet powered, some that were turboprop powered, and they were not small. They're big aircraft.
Yeah, some of them were quite small. The N9M was a single seat aircraft. It was designed essentially as a flying model of the what was going to be the XB-35 turboprop powered flying wing, and then later the YB-49, which had 8 jet engines.
Mm.
The smaller N9M was just a wonderful little thing. There were only 4 built, and one of them managed to get restored, I want to say in the 1970s, at the uh, Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California. And they used to fly that at air shows. I loved to see it fly, but I was always terrified that they were going to crash it and destroy the last remaining early Northrop flying wing. And of course, several years ago, that's exactly what happened, and I was heartbroken about that.
Yeah, it's there is that trade-off when you get historic aircraft, and if there's only one or two left, and you want to see it fly, you want to see it in its proper element, but as soon as it does, it makes you really nervous. But okay, okay. So we've got the YB-49A. That's good. We don't have that. That's not on the board so far. I mean, I must admit the variety that we're getting up there now is I'm impressed. I'm impressed. It's not just the usual suspects, so I'm glad. And this is a worthy addition to the list that we have. Okay, Peter, we're getting towards the end of our time. Is there anything else that you would like to say on the subject of the whole inspiring aviation for young people, just to sort of round things off? Is there anything that you think as an industry we should be doing to generate more interest and draw the young people into the fold?
Well, I certainly think we should be promoting the wide variety of job opportunities that there are within aviation. It seems to be expanding into a lot of different fields, particularly now when there's such a focus on sustainability, the alternate fuel and propulsion systems, introduction of um, interurban transport, kind of scaling up some of the things that we would traditionally think of as these miniature drones that you can buy off the shelf and fly as a hobby. Imagine those, much larger, able to carry passengers, here and there throughout the
Yep.
city. We're seeing more and more of that, coming true. So this is an expanding industry. There's also commercial space. Commercial space flight is something that at one time was sort of looked down on, I think, because people said, well, what's with these billionaires playing around with rockets? But turns out they're really making it into a successful venture, and that's great to see.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. If you're ever this side of the pond, please let me know that you're coming, and we'll take you down to Swift Aircraft and show you around. You can cast your eye over our ventures into the future.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so Peter Merlin, fly safe, and I will speak to you again sometime soon.
Take care.
Okay, ciao. So that was Peter Merlin. His current role at the Southern Illinois University, teaching the next generation of young minds, is an excellent position for a man of his experience. I'm sure that he has enough anecdotes and stories to inspire a generation. As for his book Dreamland, it puts a lot of things in perspective and contains a fascinating insight into aircraft development. Having had direct access to that part of the industry puts Peter in a rare and select group of people. For me, it was a pleasure to have a chat with him, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Thanks for listening, and fly safe. You have been listening to The Short Circuit, presented by Mike McLean and sponsored by Swift Aircraft with the hashtag Inspiring Aviation. This has been a Zoom Spike production.